But Trump has called himself a fighter. And it's not just this moment of an assassination attempt, but it exists within a longer story of Donald Trump ascends the presidency.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news. Hello, I'm Mari Kirk, Director of Engagement Impact at the United States Study Center. Thank you for joining us on the USSC Briefing Room today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. On the 14th of July, former President Donald Trump was shot while speaking at a campaign rally in Pennsylvania. Less than 48 hours later, he was at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for a week-long festival which culminated in his address that was watched by millions of people worldwide. Donald Trump has been called a strongman throughout his political career. How does this assassination attempt shape the mythology around him? What cultural factors contribute to this persona and perception at home and abroad? And how could this change in his standing influence perceptions of him for the rest of the election? To discuss these questions, we are welcoming USSC non-resident fellow Dr. Yancey Orr, an anthropologist and professor of environmental science at Smith College. He has conducted academic and applied fieldwork in the Philippines, Indonesia, Western New Guinea, Australia, and North America, and can bring a cross-cultural understanding of different cultural norms and how they influence politics. Yancey, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for having me.
And at the end of the podcast, we're going to get your by the numbers stat. Are you ready to go with that?
I am.
Fantastic. Can't wait to hear it. Now, we have been hearing this term strongman talked about in politics pretty consistently. I mean, it exists for a long time, but since Trump became a political figure, we've heard it a lot in reference to former President Trump. But you also talk about the concept of a big man. Can you explain the difference between a strong man and a big man, how that relates to politics, and how would those relate to some of the commentary we hear around President Trump?
Yes, so both concepts share a couple of characteristics, but there are significant differences between the two. So let me sort of first start with the idea of the big man. And this is a term that was developed in the study of Melanesia and New Guinea and other parts of the Pacific by anthropologists to try to understand how certain men, almost exclusively men, gain political power or prestige with the absence of institutions that are political or social that sort of solidify that type of power. So a big man is someone who becomes a leader of a community or groups of communities or reaches an elevated status by their personal charisma rather than their connections or their use of institutions within a given society. So big men generally are very personally charismatic. They're very strong at their ability to connect their political aspirations with desires of the community or needs within a certain amount of time or within a certain time scale of the community. So, for instance, Donald Trump is a big man because he rose to power really outside of the Republican institution the institution of the Republican Party. And so, in fact, the Republican Party deeply did not want him to be the nominee, worked against him in 2015 and 16. But he was able to do this because he aligned his political aspirations with the aspirations of communities that wanted to see a lessening of illegal immigration, that felt that American manufacturing had declined over years and saw sort of the American way of life diminishing, right? So we get this idea of making America great again. This is the alignment of someone outside of an institution associated with political power, let's say in this case, the Republican Party, and they come to power through tapping into these needs or these desires of their community. And so Donald Trump has been called a strongman. And so we could think about you have to be very strong in your personality to become a big man, that's for sure. But in fact, a strong man is in some ways a big man who develops power, but it doesn't just sort of use their personal charisma, but begins to co-opt systems of the state, like police forces or law, or even cultural phenomena to aggrandize the self, right? To hold on to power, to prevent any type of rivals. And so this is the idea of a strong man versus a big man. But the main difference is that a strong man invests or is extremely organized in using state power for their own political purposes and to maintain power. And so Donald Trump doesn't really follow that model in the same sense as there was very few political, if any, political prosecutions of his rivals while he was president. Although he said things like lock her up regarding Hillary Clinton, he in fact did not lock her up and didn't pursue any type of legal avenues against any of his opponents. And so there's that kind of strong difference, and that's quite a distinction from folks like Putin, who are big men but also very strong men. So in some cases, big men can become strong men as they co-opt tools of the state, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And so this is a kind of a clear difference. And they come, especially the big man comes to power in social systems that don't have political institutions like kingships or democracy.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating distinction, because I guess the big man uses a lot of soft power and a lot of that charisma, which I think is something that lines up with a lot of what we've seen at the Republican National Convention this week, which we will talk about a bit. But just before we get there, these concepts of big man and strong man, how far back do they stretch, and why do these concepts endure?
Yeah, so we can see these are not just modern phenomena. In fact, we see sort of charismatic religious officials or charismatic political officials gaining power through revolutions throughout time. We've seen the idea of conflating social stability of a society with the health or vigor of its leader. So very famously, Alexander the Great was given all these attributes physically, as in he did not have body odor, but he smelled just wonderful under any conditions. He was very brave. He was very strong. He was all of these types of things. He saw himself as, in some ways, being a descendant of Zeus, as well as a descendant or associated with Hercules, right? And so they just go very, very far back. And one view and a very interesting element to this is that it appears that it has its origins in the very beginnings of evidence for human cognition, or uniquely human cognition. So this idea of a big man, of someone who represents the community, right, and their health or strength is a sign of the health and strength of the community, is associated with something called sympathetic magic, which is an idea that that something that represents something else controls that thing or can be controlled by it. So if we think about magic in the form of voodoo, right, that to perform voodoo, and there are voodoo dolls, and so you can't just use a normal doll for a voodoo doll. You're to control someone or to influence them, the doll that you use for your voodoo magic has to look like them. Or even better yet, it has to contain part of their hair, right? And so this goes very far back in religions and human cognition. In fact, we can see it at the beginning of what we can identify as the earliest forms of human social organization, found in cave paintings from about 30,000 years ago, where much of the art there has to do with hunting game and with female fertility. And one view about what organizes these cave paintings, as well as the other types of art that's found there, is that you go into a cave and the community is a metaphor or a type of sympathetic organism for nature itself. And by having a healthy community, by having women that are very fertile, you create a world that's very fertile. And so in cave objects, you sort of see the beginning of this sympathetic magic at the same time that human minds start working like modern human minds, our human minds that we think of as anatomically modern. And so it has this deep root in how humans think. So it goes back to the very beginning as far as we could tell regarding symbolic knowledge.
And so that's the importance of that, almost sense of connection and a hopefulness or an aspiration, I suppose, with the idea and what's projected on to these different concepts. Very fascinating. If we turn now to think about the assassination attempt, former President Trump didn't just, survive an assassination attempt, but a bullet grazed his ear. So he actually bled. And once he knew he wasn't severely injured, he regained his composure. He stood up with a fist held high and shouted, "Fight, fight, fight." And this imagery instantly became iconic. And it felt like the defining moment in the presidential campaign. How could this, not just survival of an assassination attempt, but his strong, defiant response, influence the kind of cultural perceptions of him?
Yeah, so there's ideas of, so the fact that he was bleeding, right, is, I think, a very important case for how to interpret this. That he was bleeding, he was almost shot in the head, and there's ideas about him bleeding for his country, all right, or the idea of blood and soil, right, that there he is wounded, and he gets up, and in fact, he doesn't necessarily get up. The Secret Service get him up and try to move him to a safe location. And he stops them on two occasions. The first, or for two reasons. He stops them to look for his shoes, right? That he doesn't want to leave without his shoes, which I think is appropriately not seen as a strongman characteristic. He probably is in shock over what just happened. And the second, which is fight, 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 raising his fist, right? That's probably not shock, right? That's the message that he wants to send his supporters and the country itself. Now, we could think about this might go in other directions. So if he were a different type of person, he might have missed, the bullet might have missed him, and he might have quoted a biblical verse, right? If he was, there's all different ways in which one can interpret this. So Teddy Roosevelt, around 100 years ago, there was an attempted assassination. He is shot, and the bullet goes into his body. It stays there for the rest of his life. But it is slowed down by the case for his glasses, as well as his very thick speech that he would give. So he's shot. He goes and gives a talk with the bullet still inside him and him bleeding. And he raises his speech and he said, "Look, I'm such a bookish person. It saved my life because I've got so many things to sell because he has such a long speech," right? So there's different ways in which this takes place. But Trump has called himself a fighter. And it's not just this moment of an assassination attempt, but it exists within a longer story of Donald Trump ascends the presidency. He loses his reelection bid. There's an inappropriate attempt to maintain power through January 6th. And we don't know how much of it he's responsible for or not. Okay, but then he loses power, he's out of office, and he's going to live his life perhaps in Florida enjoying it. But instead, there's all of these lawsuits that arise, right? And he fights all of those lawsuits, and it appears that he has won most of them. It appears that he will not be spending time in jail, right? And then he comes back, and it looks like he's going to now win the presidency. And in part of this process, he unveils the weakness of the Democratic Party. Right. And so this is a long narrative about fighting with Trump, or fighting that Trump is fighting. And this goes back to him as a real estate agent, as a real estate investor and developer through the 80s. And so that is Trump fighting. And the same way the people who identify with him think about they're fighting through the decline of middle America. They're fighting through the Rust Belt and the decline of industrial jobs and their way of life. And so it is a very, very powerful metaphor for Trump and his supporters. And it makes sense. It's not uncharacteristic of him.
Yeah. And you mentioned how, the imagery, because he bled, and there was the image of the blood, how significant that was, and how some people, they might quote a Bible verse if they were, missed by the bullet or something like that. But I mean, almost instantly, after the shooting, religious imagery started circulating, showing angels or some sort of divine protection around Donald Trump. And then this religious messaging was incredibly overt at the Republican National Convention. Senator Tim Scott, who is a former presidential candidate himself, said, "Our God still saves, he still delivers, and he still sets free, because on Saturday, the devil came to Pennsylvania holding a rifle, but an American lion got back up on his feet and he roared." So is this, and he was far from the only one. This was throughout the convention. Everyone was addressing it. And not everyone, but so many of the speakers, in some way, shape, or form, it came up. And almost always, it was tied with that message of divine protection. And then this greater, I guess, purpose or meaning instilled because of that. Is this sort of confluence of religion and then the cultural and political ideas of strongmen or big men, is that common? And how does the religious element shape the narrative around that?
Yes, so there is in the cult of personality, which is the way in which an individual who leads a community is thought to be special or unique. Not that they're a great administrator, but they have these characteristics, or not that they have the right policy, but they themselves have this innate quality that makes them worthy of leading, that represents the greatness of the people that they lead, right? So in Donald Trump, right, and so within a Christian country, which the United States is predominantly Christian, that this is sort of the idiom in which this is understood, right, or expressed, right? And we think about the image of the American lion, right, getting back up on its feet. And this is, in fact, a Christian imagery that lions were seen to be a type of a symbol for the resurrection, because people thought that lion cubs were born dead. And it was only through the breath of their mother that the lion was given life after he was born, right? And so, and the idea that, of course, that this is good and evil, right? And that the devil came to Pennsylvania. Well, that certainly there's something very wrong with the young man who did this. But the idea that also that the devil is Trump's political opponents is sort of another layer that's put on top of this. And so some of the most pointed elements to this are that people say that the shots were fired at 6:11 p.m., right? And so 6:11, and this has been cited by numerous supporters of Trump, that they quote Ephesians 6:11, which it's a book in the New Testament, which has to do with the armor of God, right? That you should wear the armor of God to protect you against evil and the devil at all times, right? And so there's this idea, right, that he's protected, but it's also important to think that, or to understand that Trump didn't do anything to prevent this from happening, right? So there's another narrative in which this could take place, in which Trump wrestled an assailant or an assassin himself and turned him into the police, right? It was clearly this had nothing to do with Trump's uniqueness as a person, right, or his quality as a person. There are other assassination attempts in which the assassin sent to kill this great figure stopped when the great figure turned and looked at the assassin. The person just dropped their knife and ran away because of the power of this person. That's not the case with Donald Trump. So there are people who are attributing this to divine intervention. It's difficult to hear that, given that a far greater president and a far greater man, Abraham Lincoln, was killed by being shot in the head, a man who had just freed an enormous percentage of the American population after the Civil War. And so there's an interesting way in which that cognitive dissonance is not really worked out. Does it mean that Trump was more worthy than Lincoln? Does it mean that Trump was more worthy than JFK? But this type of idea and interpretation is not abnormal for looking at the cult of personality.
And it's complicated as well because, President Trump's life was spared, but one of the people at his rally did die from one of these bullets. So it is very complex and complicated to think about. It's not a simple or straightforward narrative at all.
Yes, and it's also a great emphasis is on the person who died was someone who served their community as a firefighter, the chief of a fire brigade, and also is reported died protecting his family, right? And so these are ways about thinking of this allegorically and about justice and injustice. And there's an image that came out recently of Trump at the man's memorial service kissing his fireman's helmet, right? And that's going to be a very vivid image.
And in Trump's speech to the RNC today, they had the man's like firefighter uniform on the stage and the helmet. And again, he kind of stopped in the middle of his speech and he walked over and came behind it and kissed the helmet. So this is a thing, this is an image that he's doing now, which sends a very clear message. But it's all steeped in this deeper meaning and the optics around all of it as well.
That's right. And unlike Australia, which has both a secular ruler just to some extent, right, the prime minister, as well as a symbolic person that represents purity in the community in the form of the king or queen, right? The United States, there's not that distinction. So it doesn't allow for, let's say, a political operator outside of the symbolic system of virtue. Right. And so those are conflated together in the U.S., which leads for these types of interpretations that may seem a bit unusual for people from the Commonwealth.
And you mentioned Donald Trump branding himself or being perceived as a fighter, that, him as a fighter, this has been a huge narrative throughout his campaign, and then a huge theme throughout the Republican National Convention. And even, just the person who spoke before Donald Trump was Dana White, who's the head of the UFC. And then we also had Hulk Hogan, and, Donald Trump called out Hulk Hogan in his speech. I mean, they were not doing anything subtle about this theme of him being a fighter and then having these different, fighters on the stage in some way was a huge element of the RNC this week. Why do you think they portrayed that in such a overt way, that this was something that we're lining up these people who are actually associated with battle and fighting in some way, shape, or form? Why was that part of the lineup they had this week?
Yes, so Trump had this association going back decades where he actually wrestled in an event with WWE, right, the kind of stage wrestling association. He's been interviewed by UFC fighters in the last few weeks or last month. So there's this association because Trump has clearly brought his persona into the realm or into representing American masculinity or masculinity in general, right? And so he talks very tough to some degree, right? Has a very aggressive approach in business. There's other elements of his masculine aggression that people find particularly distasteful. And there is a cynical view, which is that Trump is speaking to the masculinity that has been lost or that feels threatened in the United States over the last few decades. There may be a less cynical view. That such an approach allows you to ignore or interpret the real grievances that the American public have for how they've been treated by the government for the last several decades. So, for instance, is there a point that the American population have about the lack of industrial jobs or the influx of illegal immigrants to the United States? Well, if you just say that this is a result of masculine insecurity of American men, then you don't have to address that problem. And so, yes, he does represent these forces, but do those forces have a point? That's worth considering, not just to sort of write it away, but there is this strong focus about Trump the fighter, both even from either as a political fighter, as physically fighting for other people, which is a very strong stretch, but then also legally fighting what is called lawfare that's been used against him over the last year or so, right? And so this would tear most people apart, I think, fair enough. I mean, if you have 4 lawsuits against you, you're running to be president, all of these types of things, you have financial issues that were going on, but he keeps on going. So he is, in fact, a fighter. I mean, it's difficult to refute that assessment of him.
So thanks so much for sharing with us today, talking us through this really complex topic. And I would love to get your by the numbers stat. What do you have for us today, Yancey?
Well, the stat is 280%. And that is the increase of people across the world who have been killed in armed conflict if you average the Trump years as opposed to the Biden years. So 280% increase in death from warfare and violent conflict around the world. And so we often think about Donald Trump's rhetoric of a strongman or a big man as being flamboyant or irresponsible or inflammatory, but it may have resulted in deterrence. And with the Biden administration, it's effectively impossible to argue that we did not do anything but lose deterrence, right? So we have invasions in the Ukraine, we have Hamas attack last year, and we have other types of conflict revving up. And there's been approximately 180,000 people have died per year over the Biden administration as a result of a loss of deterrence. So we may not find Donald Trump's rhetoric particularly attractive for many sensitive people, but it may be effective in dealing with the world as it is and not as some type of imaginary space that the Biden administration came into power thinking that it was.
Wow. Very sobering statistic and fascinating insight. Thank you, Yancey. So as we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest to our listeners. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is the co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast with Jude Blanchett, the Freeman Chair for China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'd also recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our Election Watch 2024 series of events. You can find these on our website at ussc.edu.au or wherever you get your